Greetings, everybody. Hope you're doing well, your families, and things are coming along as usual. If I can be a help to you, please contact me by email or call. We have about 31, 2 days of schools left, probably less than that. We have quite a bit to do in that time, and we're going to start today with chapter 19 called Politics and Economics. Now, what is politics? Well, politics simply is how you work out public policy. We elect these people to come up with the ideas and execute and implement public policy, and how they go about doing that is called politics. Economics, of course, having to deal with money. So we're going to look at this politics and economics. The year is 1968. Nixon is running against Vice President of, for Lyndon Johnson. His name is Hubert Humphrey. It was a close election, but Nixon prevailed, and we're going to take a look at that and see why this is going and how this is going to come down. Okay, so why does it matter? Well, Kissinger and Nixon, Kissinger being his closest advisor, wanted to change the world of diplomacy with the Russians, the Chinese, Southeast Asia. Nixon promised to get out of Vietnam. Nixon promised to build bridges of communication, and it was highly welcomed by most of the country, which had spent the last 25 years in the Red Scare, in the Cold War, nothing really going on but distrust and suspicions with the Russians and the Chinese, and Nixon saw that that could end to our economic advantage by opening trade, cheap labor markets, so forth and so on, and still going on pretty much to this day. He also promised to return to more traditional values. To win the presidency, Nixon had to have a Southern strategy to collect the Southern states. He got some, but not all. He promised to appoint conservatives to the federal courts. He promised a Southerner on the Supreme Court. He promised to oppose court order busing. Now, what is busing? Busing is was implemented to achieve racial equality. So people bought homes in neighborhoods, and a lot of people bought those homes according to how good the school was. So now they invest in their communities. They pay property taxes for their kids to go to school. Busing meant they were now going to go to a school in another area, another neighborhood. In other words, they went across the tracks, and they did it by busing. And people weren't too happy about it on neither side. But that was the issue of the day. He promised to choose a vice president from the South, and he chose Spiro Agnew from Maryland. It all went well. The South bought all this. You can see by the map, the red states being Nixon, the blue is Humphrey. No one in the South except Texas voted at all for Humphrey. The yellow states there, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, all went to George Wallace, a avowed segregationist. And he was avowed states' rights, and that was enough to get him some votes. He was later paralyzed in an assassination attempt, and he dropped out of the picture. But Nixon won a lot of states, but it was not a landslide, and it was a rather close election. But he managed to pull this one out, having lost a close election 8 years before to John F. Kennedy. So Nixon is president, and he comes in with a new idea. Not a new idea, but a new approach. And he declared the idea that some bureaucratic elite in Washington knows what's best for the people is really a contention that people cannot govern themselves. And this resonated very much with most people. And it ended up giving Nixon the presidency. But what he's really saying here is, you know what's best for yourself. You don't need the government to tell you you're too stupid to do with your money what you want to do. And people voted for him. He also promised, within this new federalism, he came along with what is called revenue sharing. Revenue sharing is granting federal money to state and local agencies to do with as they choose. He had hoped, Nixon had hoped, that the states would become much more non-dependent on the federal government. He wanted to devote most of his time to his passion, which was foreign policy, as we'll see in a minute. Excuse me. But what happened was the states became more dependent on the government for their incomes, for the money involved. Now, Nixon's doctrine in foreign policy was working towards a gradual withdrawal from Vietnam and let the Vietnamese take over for themselves. This idea was called Vietnamization. We read about that in chapter 17. As you can see by this picture, there's 6 American GIs, not much older than you, one peasant Vietnamese woman, and this whole idea was really meant to withdraw our troops and let the Vietnamese fight it out for themselves, which happened. But it happened, they were terrible. They were poor soldiers, and they ended up losing the war. Meantime, Nixon, working behind the scenes, wanted to have a summit or a high-level meeting with Mao Zedong, the leader of China, pictured here. And Nixon being the first president to get to China, visit China. And it opened up a whole cultural opportunities. One, and as I shared with you yesterday about playing ping pong, the connection was right here. And the connection was that the Chinese, who are fantastic ping pong players, ended up dominating the sport in the world and really dominated the Olympics. Perhaps you remember in Forrest Gump, the ping pong matches with China, all for propaganda purposes, well, maybe some goodwill as well. Now, the Russians, very much surprised that Nixon would talk to the Chinese. They wanted to get in the game too. So they invited him to come to the Soviet Union in something called détente. Détente is a relaxation of tensions. And the Nixons believed that negotiation with the communists was a better way for the United States to achieve its international goals and let the world know that capitalism was much better for the individual rather than communism. So to ease tensions, Nixon goes to the Soviet Union. And in return, sometime later, President Brezhnev of the Soviet Union visited Nixon in Washington at a summit meeting, a high-level diplomatic meeting. Now, one of the things they did achieve was SALT I Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It froze the number of strategic nuclear weapons. It agreed to increase trade, and it helped, indeed, ease the tensions of the two countries. Now, the freezing a number of strategic nuclear weapons was a nice idea. However, both countries had thousands and thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. And to freeze them, good idea, but hey, how many times can you destroy the earth over and over? The trade increase was very good for both countries, mostly the Russians, and détente proved to be economic advantage. So a couple of questions for you. All right, I have a question coming in. Does revenue sharing, how does it work? Well, the government gives back the taxes it took from the people to its local area, and they choose how to spend that money. As I said, it did cause more dependence on the federal government. A summit, high-level meeting between high-level diplomats. To summarize Nixon's major domestic and foreign policy initiatives, well, one was the new federalism that helped with revenue sharing. It reduced federal government programs in favor of state programs. He worked on law and order. He targeted the protesters first. He did put conservatives in the court and in government. And on foreign policy, his Vietnamization and détente with communist powers was probably, as history will declare, very effective. Last couple questions. What were Nixon's key victories in the 1968 election? He appealed to the silent majority who did not protest. These were hard-working people who were not too happy with the way the country was going. They saw Nixon as a viable alternative. And what do you think his greatest foreign policy achievement was? It's a toss-up. He did get us out of Vietnam as he promised. He did open up relations with China. He did open up relationships with the Russians, economic ones, military ones, scientific ones. And had it not been for Watergate, Nixon probably would have gone down, and in many circles still does, as one of our greatest foreign policy presidents. Okay, please complete lesson review 19.1, numbers 1 to 5. Get it in as soon as you can, and have a fine day. We'll see you with section 2